Another environmental problem that comes from this is that you get a lot of waste here. If you concentrate this many animals in one location, they're going to be dropping a lot of waste. And when it rains, we've talked about watersheds before, all that rainwater is going to pick up all of that waste. All of that waste water is going to flow downstream. It's going to flood aquatic ecosystems, not only with nutrients, but now with organic waste matter. And that has to be decomposed, which will use up all the dissolved oxygen in the waterways. You're going to get a lot of dead fish as a result. We also use something analogous here. Oh, here's another CAFO. Pigs, which are kept inside CAFOs. Here you can see the pens where they're kept wall to wall. This is a mother pig suckling her piglets. She's kept inside this cage, can't really stand up at any point. And then here you can see a cow milking operation, all of the cows kind of centered around here. So it's very industrial. This is when I say industrial agriculture or industrial meat production, these are the types of organizations I'm talking about. Not a family farm, but a large, very much mechanical process where animals are kind of packed in close together. These have a much larger impact on the environment in terms of pollution, in terms of destruction of the habitat around, because after all, a family farm is basically a large grassland. Yeah, maybe some of the habitat has been cleared away to create a prairie, essentially, or grassland-like ecosystem for grazing, but these concentrated animal feeding lots are essentially just large waste areas for lots and lots of animals to drop, to deposit their waste, which then washes into waterways. We also have aquaculture. So here we have some fisheries. Each of these nets holds a very, very large number of fish. So fish are also grown in these kind of concentrated animal feeding organizations. And that is the world's fastest growing type of food production. It's cheap. Fish reproduce relatively quickly. You don't need as much food to gain as much biomass of fish as would be required by like cows. Same goes for chicken. It takes less space, less water, less food resources to grow the same amount of chicken as it would cow. Pigs are between chicken and cow. You can do economic calculations for how much overall final meat production you'll get for the amount of resource investment. We also, as opposed to the family farm, have industrialized agriculture for crop production. So what you can see here in this GIF is fields, endless fields, is all the way up to the horizon, right? In every direction, you can see that it's just wheat fields. So instead of having a landscape that is full of diverse ecosystems, maybe forest over here, a wetland over here, a riparian ecosystem over here. Riparian is where a aquatic ecosystem meets a forest ecosystem. All these different possibilities, and maybe a grassland here with different plants competing for succession. Remember, we were talking about the succession of a forest earlier. Instead, we have wiped the slate clean on this entire landscape, and we've created one kind of crop. We've created a monoculture, just one type of plant. And that plant has very low genetic diversity because it's been artificially selected to have exactly the same kind of traits. Every single one of these plants has exactly the same kind of traits. Because more and more and more of the Earth's surface is being converted over to the purpose of food production, and the foods that we want come from a very low diversity of crops, a very small number of crop species, and those crop species have very low genetic diversity amongst them. As the human population grows and we need more crops to feed that population, overall biodiversity worldwide has to decrease in order to meet that demand. After all, this is Unit 3, Human Population Growth and Impacts on Biodiversity. So if you were confused as to why I was spending so much time talking about food production, here I can finally bring it back for you. The way in which we produce food necessitates a decrease in overall global biodiversity because we need to convert large tracts of land, large sections of ecosystem into agricultural space, partly to grow grains and leafy vegetables to feed ourselves, but also to grow crops to feed to animals in order to feed ourselves. And we have found ways to grow even more animals, to create more and more and more animals in these concentrated animal feeding organizations, way more than we ever have before, but that necessitates an even larger footprint of crops than we ever have before. So more and more land needs to be converted to agricultural space, all of which has these monocultures growing on it. So the way that the growing human population demands food resources does in fact decrease global biodiversity. To close out this video, I have some vocabulary terms you guys are going to want to write down. First of all, the Green Revolution, a large increase in crop production in developing countries achieved by the use of fertilizers, pesticides, and high-yield crop varieties. So high-yield crop varieties, those come from artificial selection and genetically modified organisms. Pesticides, developed by chemists over the years, like, for example, the Monsanto Corporation. Fertilizers, the first nitrogen-based fertilizers came out after World War I. I may have mentioned this story before, but there was a chemist working for the German war effort who was attempting to build better types of munitions, or cheaper types of munitions, I believe was actually the case, because they couldn't buy the explosives that they needed. So he was trying to find a way to make essentially a kind of fertilizer bomb using nitrogen from the air, and he came up with this process, which is the same process now that we use for creating artificial fertilizers. But that chemical trick that he invented basically enabled us to dramatically increase crop yields worldwide. So the Green Revolution is basically a description of the way that all of these technologies, fertilizers, pesticides, and high-yield crop varieties, allowed us to dramatically increase our food output as humans. Industrialized and high-input agriculture utilizes heavy equipment, lots of fossil fuels in order to fuel all of that heavy equipment, in order to transport all of those materials, in order to fuel these operations. These are sometimes 24-hour working operations, uses lots of fertilizers and lots of pesticides, and monoculture, growing a single crop variety. So right here, what you can see is a monoculture. All of this wheat, a single crop variety as far as the eye can see. Next slide. Traditional low input agriculture still utilizes energy, and it will obviously every farm is going to use some fossil fuels, but more reliance on things like solar energy and human labor to grow a crop that will feed a family with no surplus. So this is what you get in less developed countries. They are using much more traditional agricultural methods where you're relying on a family for workers. Later, we're going to talk about children as an economic factor, whether having a large number of children represents an economic burden or an economic boon to you as a parent. And in less developed countries where many families are operating farms with traditional agriculture, the consideration shifts more in the direction that children are an economic advantage, because they're not just another mouth to feed, they're another pair of hands to be able to help grow more food. Whereas in more developed countries where we have more industrialized agriculture, where a lot of it's done with large machines and very dedicated specialized workers, expert workers, having more children is less of an economic incentive. Obviously, there are other reasons to have children, but this is a point of discussion that we will have. And then the last vocabulary terms on here are organic agriculture, which is kind of the opposite of the industrialized agricultural methods, where they use lots of pesticides and lots of chemical fertilizers and lots of other high technology type methods. When someone says they're using organic agriculture, typically what they mean is that they're growing the crops without the use of synthetic pesticides, without inorganic fertilizers, or without any kind of genetic engineering in terms of gene splicing. They are allowed to use fertilizers. They just have to be natural fertilizers, like using manure, for instance, or compost. They are allowed to use pesticides, but they might, for example, use a specific kind of bacteria that eats away at the stomach lining of caterpillars, but is harmless to humans. That is an organic pesticide that you can use that, and it's still within the permissible standards of organic agriculture. You are allowed to use genetic engineering as long as you are only using artificial selection for crops. You're allowed to select the largest varieties and breed them together, and that is still altering the genome of the population that you are working with, but in the same way that humans have been doing for thousands of years. Organic farms typically utilize polycultures where they are growing several crops simultaneously, so they're a lot more biodiverse, and they have a lower environmental impact because they're not using heavy pesticides, they're not using heavy inorganic fertilizers. However, they cannot be operations typically on the same scale as these large industrialized organizations. The advantage of using Roundup Ready crops and lots of pesticides and using large machines for harvesting is that you can have a large operation that doesn't require so much tedious micromanaging of the individual crops, and that's also why it's convenient to use a large monoculture for everything. But if you're doing an organic farm, you have to do a lot more individual weeding. You're going to have to use a polyculture in order to keep the overall diversity of the crops. You're going to need to rotate the crops in order to keep the nutrients in the soil, so you can't really use monoculture as much. You're going to need to use alternate methods, and you just can't have the same scale. So typically organic farms are locally distributed, which also means that they aren't using as much fossil fuels in terms of transportation of their goods. And when you buy from them, they are probably the money is going to go back into your local economy. Not always. Go ahead and check the company, that the label that you are purchasing any organic produce or anything from. But that is more typical of organic agriculture than it would be of industrialized agriculture. Proponents of organic agriculture will also say that organic produce has a higher nutrient content than produce created through other means. However, this has not been supported by peer-reviewed scientific literature. Another great thing about the organic agriculture approach is the lower use of pesticides means that fewer pesticides are spreading into local ecosystems, which means that insect predators like spiders in those ecosystems are able to survive, and they are able to conduct the ecosystem service of biological control of pest species. So it keeps down on populations of like mosquitoes and other types of insects like roaches and things like that otherwise might be problems for humans. Always remember that idea that we talked about way at the beginning of the course. Damage to ecosystems removes ecosystem services, which means that money, real money that we would have to spend through taxes and paying for infrastructure and mitigating costs from environmental damage, would be lost from our pocket if we lose those ecosystem services. This next slide shows a diagram from the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization that generates some statistics about the way that we grow food. The top indicates Earth's total surface. Now, 29% of the land of Earth's surface is indicated by this brown chunk, and then you can see 71% ocean is indicated by this little gray here, and it kind of gets cut off because we're only interested in the land part. So you can imagine that the pie slice or the chunk of this rectangle that is ocean would just keep extending way over to the right super far, but we're not interested in that. We're just interested in the 29% of the Earth's surface that's land, which is this brown rectangle. Now, of that brown rectangle, 71% of that 29% is habitable land. It's the part that we can actually use. 10% is glaciers, and 19% is barren land. It's just rock, right? You can't grow anything there, or it's like permafrost, or like deep, barren desert. It's just unusable territory. So only 71% is what we would consider habitable land. The rest is like salt flats or completely dead rock or glaciers. Of that 71% of the 29%, half is now converted for agricultural land. Half of the habitable land on Earth is being used for agricultural land. 37% is being used for forests, 11% shrubland, 1% urban, and 1% freshwater sources, fresh like lakes and rivers and ponds and stuff. Very, very, very tiny percent of that non-ocean surface is fresh waters. So half of the habitable land on Earth is used for agricultural production. Now think back to when we were talking about energy flow diagrams and trophic structures, and consider that of that agricultural land, 77% of the crops grown on that land go to livestock, to feed livestock, and 23% goes to crops that are intended to feed directly to people. So that's for grains, for like corn and wheat for baking bread, and for rice for feeding directly to people, and for leafy vegetables for salads, or for anything else that you like, for making soups and all that. That's the crops being fed directly to people, baked potatoes and all that kind of good stuff. And then the rest of the crops are used to feed livestock. But in terms of calorie consumption, only 17% of global calories are gotten from that meat, and 83% of our calories come from plant-based food sources. There's an inefficiency here. This is not me getting on a soapbox about meat production versus vegetarian diets. It's about the efficiency with which we are using this land resource. We can use a smaller footprint of the land, perhaps less than 50% of all habitable land on Earth, by shifting our diets away from the livestock section and towards more plant-based options. That doesn't necessarily mean eliminating the meat altogether, but even something as simple as shifting from beef to chicken would reduce the overall physical footprint of agricultural space required. And then if you take a look at the protein supply, everyone knows that you get more protein gram for gram from meat than you do from plants. But in terms of global consumption, we actually as humans get 67% of our protein from plant-based sources and only 33% from meat and dairy. The reason why this is larger than the calories is because, yeah, you do get more protein gram for gram from meat and dairy, but as humans, we mostly get our calories and our food from plants. So again, this is just about resource use. Plants are more efficient uses of space than meat production is. What about other resources, though? Land use per gram of protein by food type. So if you were to compare different types of meat, beef and mutton, sheep, uses 1 square meter per gram of protein. Pork uses 0.13 square meters per gram of protein. Fresh produce, 0.1 square meter. Poultry, less than that. Eggs, less than that. Dairy, less than that. Wheat, less than that. So you can, and corn, less than that, and rice, less than that. So you can see why I'm saying, if you switch from, say, beef to chicken, you would actually use less agricultural footprint, less space to grow your food. And then we could reduce the amount of land, of territory, of natural ecosystem that's converted to agricultural space for the amount of calories we need to sustain the population. Greenhouse gas emissions per gram of protein by food type. Again, beef and mutton, way here at the top. Large amounts of greenhouse gases emitted per gram of protein. This is 221 grams of carbon dioxide equivalents emitted per gram of beef, But fresh produce, it's not like there's zero carbon production, but it's still 37 grams of CO2 equivalents. CO2 equivalents, there are other greenhouse gases emitted, but they are using CO2 as a kind of standard measurement of the impact of those greenhouse gases on climate change. Pork, roughly the same, actually. Dairy, about the same. Poultry, a little bit less. Eggs, a little bit less. Rice, a little bit less. Corn and wheat, far less down here. Average gallons of irrigation, so water use per 1,000 calories consumed by human. Again, beef at the very top of this list. 434 gallons of water used to produce 1,000 calories of beef, whereas all of these other categories are way down here, about a tenth the amount. So one of the major ways in which human population growth affects biodiversity is by clearing away natural ecosystems. It's called habitat destruction, and making space for agricultural territory. But the majority of agricultural territory is actually dedicated to feeding livestock. And the least efficient use of livestock actually turns out to be beef and mutton. So that's the only point I'm trying to make with these graphs, is that dietary shifts actually are some of the most environmentally impactful ways that you can alter your personal contribution to habitat destruction and biodiversity loss worldwide. In this class, we usually appeal to more economic solutions, and in this case, the more economic solution would be simply to remove the meat subsidies that already exist to the cattle industry. As a result, meat would become slightly more expensive, but you're already paying that cost in your taxes, so you're not actually paying any more for it. We could potentially reduce the tax rate if we remove some of those subsidies. Admittedly, that's not what usually happens. The tax money would just flow to some other service, but perhaps it could flow to some environmentally beneficial service instead. And therefore, when consumers are making decisions about meal planning, they would simply choose the less environmentally impactful options rather than the more environmentally impactful options. One thing to always keep in mind about economics, whenever I talk about economics in this course, it uses money because money is just the method by which we assign numeric values to things, right? We value this and we value that. How much do we value it? Well, we can put a number on that, and that's money. But economics is actually the study of the way people make decisions. So by changing the apparent value of an item, we can change the way decisions make it easier to make environmentally beneficial decisions without requiring everyone to sacrifice their own personal interests. And incidentally, this would not be the same as just applying an arbitrary tax to something that's environmentally damaging, because all we would be doing is removing a subsidy, so it would be forcing it to compete on a fair marketplace. The actual cost of raising and bringing that meat to market would be reflected in the price of that product. Industrialized agriculture in total uses 38% of the world's habitable land. The rest is traditional and organic agriculture. Emits 25% of all greenhouse gas emissions. Removes 70% of water from surface sources and aquifers. And produces 60% of all water pollution. So this is why I focused on food production at the beginning. This is one of the most significant ways in which we alter the Earth's environment. Now, to wrap up these first two videos, one last way in which the way we produce food affects the environment is that when we have a monoculture, which is, again, how we usually grow food, as one kind of crop over a large area, that same kind of crop will pull the same types of nutrients out of the soil over and over and over again. And that can deplete that nutrient from the soil. Usually we use artificial fertilizers to keep putting it back in. We don't always do a great job in maintaining the chemical balance of the soil. And sometimes we have to completely replace the topsoil. But topsoil, as it turns out, is a slowly renewable resource. You get really good topsoil from grasslands. Grasslands produce thick, nutrient-dense loam, but at a very slow pace. They naturally produce it, but very, very slowly. So the global supply of topsoil is actually kind of limited. Another thing that we do is we irrigate our crops quite a lot, which uses up a large portion of the world's supply of fresh water, but we pull it up from groundwater sources, and there's little bits, trace amounts of salt in that water. And I talked about this when we talked about ecosystem diversity and desertification, how deserts are getting larger. Well, when that water is irrigated over the crops, the salts are left behind and the water can evaporate away. Most water that's irrigated on crops just evaporates away. And so we just keep irrigating the crops and keep irrigating the crops, but the salt content of the soil gradually increases over time. And these two factors, the depletion of the nutrients and the oversalting of the soils, can stress the soils to the degree that the crops can no longer grow. And if the crops can't grow, there's no roots to hold the soil together. And then you can get something like the Dust Bowl that we had in the Great Depression, where the whole American Midwest, you have these big dust storms coming through where they're just blowing the soil entirely off of the land's surface. There's no crops growing. We're just all of these giant dust storms blowing all that soil away. And maybe not as dramatic as that, but this also causes a lot of areas to become more vulnerable to erosion, which typically happens when rain falls and it carries soil particles and rock particles and anything else that the rainwater can pick up along with it. And erosion is how like canyons form over time, slowly carving away part of the Earth's surface. It's how landslides get formed, the giant mudslides, right? Removing sections of road and things like that. Because the soil can't be held together anymore because there's no plants to hold it. When this happens, the topsoil pollution can get into surface waters, it can kill fish, it can clog reservoirs and lakes, and any pesticides that are in that soil can then get into food webs and food chains in other ecosystems, and they can become biomagnified. And I actually don't remember if we've covered this in earlier videos yet or not. For the same reason that you need large tracts of land in order to support enough plant life to do enough photosynthesis to get the energy up to the next trophic level, right, to the herbivores, to support enough herbivores to be able to sustain the carnivores, to be able to create enough of those primary consumers or secondary consumers at that point to be able to sustain the tertiary consumers, right, up at the very top, right? The more space you have, the more levels of a food chain you can have. Well, that also means that the bigger your ecosystem and the more pesticides, say, you could have spread out across this ecosystem, the more that pesticide is going to get into this food chain, and all of that primary production of the plants, it's going to go to these herbivores, and all those herbivores are going to get eaten by primary consumers, and all those primary consumers are going to get eaten by secondary consumers, and all those secondary consumers will be eaten by a small population of tertiary consumers. And if you can imagine, as energy is flowing up the trophic structure, all of those pesticides that were diffused over a large area of the ecosystem, they are slowly being collected together through the food chain and being concentrated to a smaller and smaller number of organisms. And you can do chemical tests that find out that as you move up levels of a food chain, certain types of toxins will actually increase in concentration. This is why fish, like tuna, will have high concentrations of methylmercury in their system. The methylmercury actually comes from coal-fired power plants. It spreads out through the atmosphere. It settles into aquatic ecosystems. It's picked up by algae. Those algae are consumed by zooplankton. Those zooplankton are eaten by smaller fish. Those smaller fish are eaten by larger fish. Those larger fish are eaten by even bigger fish like tuna. But because the tuna have to eat lots and lots of little fish in order to maintain their mass, and those little fish need to eat lots and lots of zooplankton in order to maintain their mass, and those zooplankton have to eat lots and lots of algae in order to sustain their biomass, it means that all of the methylmercury from a very big area eventually ends up in just a couple of these tuna. So that's what we call biomagnification. And this is a risk when we have all of the pesticides from a farm being delivered through erosion into other types of ecosystems. So soil stress is a big concern as well. We'll talk more about this idea a little bit later on.